Joe, sorry for my fat fingers. I accidentally pressed your number. I was trying to press someone else's.
Not a problem.
Morning, Rabbi Bennett. Hey, Roy.
Hi, Roy.
Morning. How are you?
Greg.
Good morning, everyone.
And Ellen and Marion and Randy and Rick and Rosalie. I feel like romper room.
Scroll around.
Someone has festive music tones on their computer. Now we've got about 45 more seconds. We'll do our typical 10:02 start because I still see people popping in. All right, well, it is 10:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. Happy Thursday, everyone. Thanks for making the time to join our call. Before we move on to, we have an agenda this morning. Before I move on to Brian, any questions for me? I'm the least exciting member of this. I'm just sort of your host, Ricardo Montalban. I sort of just organize things, but nobody has questions for me. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
They're scared off by your guns, Greg. You're wearing a short sleeve shirt today, and it's just got everybody thrown. I'm
giving blood today. So Joe, I'm giving blood, just so you know.
There you go. The American Red Cross is a great organization. Okay, so we do have a really one really big focused agenda item, and that's for Rory to share and talk about JCRE. But before we get to that, there are a couple of, I see David's on the call, and I know there's been so much that's been happening nationally and at the state capitol. You want to just let everybody know what's going on? You are muted, David. You're muted.
That was probably better that way. So it's kind of a mess right now. I mean, we're finishing up a special session in the state capitol that took a really interesting turn in the Senate with a bill that is now going to blow up the next special session that we're going to have. The good news is revenues continue to come in right in Missouri. So July, we had really good revenue numbers. Part of the reason we had those good numbers was because the income tax delay from April to July came in. They still were better than expected. August numbers came in very strong. Sales tax was strong, good indicators. Personal income tax was pretty strong. It was pretty clear that people were spending the $600 a week that they were getting in the economy in the state. It was pretty clear that that $1,200 was being spent even as personal rates of savings are going up. So that's all very, very positive. There is some concern that that's going to peter out a little bit with the reduction in the unemployment insurance down from 600 to 300 in the state, as well as kind of some uncertainty about what's going to happen at the federal level with the various packages. You know, right now at the federal level, there is, I mean, regardless of what you read in the paper, there are conversations between the White House and between the House Democrats. Those are the two primary stakeholders in the conversation. They're still pretty far apart on a number of important items. But it is clear that something is going to have to move forward. The stock market is doing great. There's no doubt about that. We're going to see a lot of that. But we also know that, you know, states are struggling, local governments are still struggling. We still have this pandemic that's out there. So that's not going away. So even though we feel good when we look at the Dow and we feel good when we look at the S&P, you know, we open up our window and we realize everybody's still wearing a mask and the unemployment rate is still around, I don't know what it came out to this morning, but it'll be somewhere around 10%. And that's not a good figure in general. And so I think folks are extremely concerned. The thing that's not complicating is the wrong word to use, it's a bad term, but the thing that's really overlaying all of this is kind of the conversation around protests, the conversation around some of the violence that's happening right now on both sides. And that is creating a more highly politicized environment. Even though we're in an election, you would expect a politicized environment. That's creating some issues as well. So we do believe they're still talking. We do think that there is a need and there's an interest in moving forward and that we will see something happen here. It's just a matter of when, but Missouri is holding up pretty well at this point. And schools are starting and stopping and starting and stopping and that kind of stuff. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but there's not a lot to report.
Yeah, any questions for David about anything? We talk maybe for 1 second, just very briefly about the unemployment tax thing and where it stands, because it came up the other day too.
Sure. So as part of the executive action in the White House, the president issued an executive order that allowed for an additional $300 on unemployment comp to come in. This ostensibly replaces the sunset on the $600 that was put out. The second issue that was addressed within that executive order was a deferment of payroll taxes. So again, not a forgiveness of payroll taxes, but a deferment. The idea is that you can leave more money in your employee's check by saying, listen, we can defer these taxes to January 1st of next year, so you don't have to pay them, but you still got to pay them in January coming up. And so that was a business by business decision whether they wanted to do that. One of the issues brought up yesterday is you've got an employee, you defer the taxes in the fourth quarter of the year, and then all of a sudden they leave you on January 2nd and you haven't collected any of those payroll taxes. Are you on the hook for their share of the payroll taxes from them? And so I don't actually have an answer to that, but that's a really good question. But there was a great article yesterday that came out, I don't know if it was in the Wall Street Journal or it was in the Hill actually, that talked about very few companies are selecting this kind of deferment because of the uncertainty around it, I think, more than anything else. And it doesn't really, if you have a really immediate cash flow problem, maybe it helps, but it doesn't really do anything structurally for what's going on. So that's in place. We're trying to get a little more information about that. And Miriam just was kind enough to send me a note. A guy named Brian Colby, who works for the Missouri Budget Project, was on a call, I guess, and I know Brian pretty well, about 2022 finances. There is no question that states are going to struggle in 21 and 22, that this recovery is going to not bounce right back from the standpoint, whatever's happening in the stock market, from the standpoint of employees. In fact, you know, there's very few economists that are predicting we move back to 4% unemployment or 3.5% unemployment. for many years, if at all. And so we're going to be struggling, with what we would have considered to be decent unemployment numbers at 5%, 5.5% 10 years ago, which are not anymore. So 22 will have some difficulty in terms of sales tax revenue and most importantly, income tax revenue. So I agree with that. The issue really is if the feds allow for one, a no strings approach to the money that's already been allocated under the COVID package. So that state and local government relief that came in, and the state's sitting on about $1 billion+ of that. And there's any additional relief that goes into state and local governments. Originally Republicans said, no way, we're not bailing out Illinois' pension problem. Democrats said we want $1 trillion for that particular pot of money, which is an amazingly large amount of money. I mean, like $1 trillion. Like I'm almost incredulous that we actually use the term trillion whenever we talk about anything in the budget, but that's what we're doing. And just to put context on that, the original huge COVID package had $150 billion for state and local governments, and Missouri got almost $2.5 billion of that money. So, that's 10% of our entire spend as a state budget on an annual basis. So that's a massive amount of money that comes in. So assuming the feds do something that's closer to that 100 billion mark and allow the no strings approach, it is likely there will be sufficient revenue to cover the shortfalls that are going to occur in both 21 and 22. But his point is valid that if those things don't materialize, 22 is going to be a hell of a hard year. The other thing that's going to happen, because we have this screwy set of revenues coming in that was never anticipated, is that we're about to usher in the next tax cut. So Missouri is in a tax cut mode right now under a bill called Senate Bill 507, where if revenues hit a certain plateau, the state income tax rate, the marginal rate, automatically steps down. All the way from, we used to have a 6% marginal rate at the top end. The top end under 507 is about 5.01%. And so we are in the process of stepping that income tax rate down. That's a real dollar. I mean, that's a real money. That's $100+ million per percentage, 1/10 of a percentage point that comes down. So these are very substantial dollars. And the problem is because we got a bunch of federal money that came in, even though it was COVID relief, that is actually labeled as revenue. And it goes into the formula for determining whether or not the tax cut goes into play, which means we're going to trigger at least one tax cut this year, if not two. And so that's going to push against the revenues coming into the next year. So I think that's what most people are concerned about.
So for those of you who haven't glazed over entirely about the revenue 301 or 201, I don't think that was 101, but are there any questions? And aside from like crying into the fact that this is going to go through 2022 in some form or fashion or another. Yeah, Karen. Yeah, go ahead.
Mindful that we are a bunch of nonprofit folks. Question. What does happen immediately, or what changes very quickly, David, if the political winds change in November?
Can you expand that just a tiny bit?
If the governor loses and the Republican Party, I realize I'm being extremely idealistic. If the Republican Party loses potentially its supermajority status.
So one, it is highly unlikely that the Republican Party will lose supermajority status, meaning they hold a 2/3 margin, because the numbers are pretty drastic on how that would have to happen. It is not, in polling and statistics, there's always a conversation about the chances are low, but they're not zero. When they're not zero, you can't be surprised if it happens. So there is, the chances of Governor Parson losing the election is not zero. It is a real possibility that people, you have to factor in. The chances of the House Democrats dropping below 107 is low. Like low is in really low. They would have to lose a lot of seats, and they would have to have a complete run of the tables for the seats that they occupy. There is zero chance that the Missouri Senate drops to that level because there's just not enough seats in play.
Right.
That's all there
Okay.
is to it. I mean, there is literally 2 possible seats that could flip in the Missouri Senate, and that's it, you know, from Republican to Democrat. And that will not change whether or not there's a supermajority status in terms of a veto-proof majority is your point.
Okay, thank you.
What does change though, Karen, I think that's important, Missouri's got an extremely strong governor, and they control every part of the operation of the state of Missouri, which means mostly new cabinet positions, a sweeping out on policy issues, you know, where Medicaid, corrections, all these departments, you know, they have to essentially march to a new drummer, which means they're going to, and we see this whenever there's a turnover on political party, Democrat to Republican and vice versa. So that does have a very substantial impact on organizations that are providing services. In fact, that in some ways creates a whipsaw effect on those organizations working under one set of assumptions, and all of a sudden, you know, and Brian, I think you're doing a lot of this planning right now internally with organizations through some of the opportunities that you're creating. You know, this is going to create a real need for people to understand what that whipsaw actually looks like and how to be anticipating those changes, Karen, to your point. But I'm just not sure that it makes a lot of sense to do that planning before that happens, because the political ramifications of doing that planning could also have impacts.
So thank you for the segue, David. I just wanted to let Nikki remind everyone what David was referring to was scenario planning, right? We don't know what the future is going to hold, but there are some more likely scenarios. How do we as organizations, and we're not talking about 6 or 12 months, we're not talking about 3 or 6 months, we're talking about 12 plus months away. How do we as organizations prepare ourselves mentally, maybe emotionally, but certainly budgetarily and other things for what kinds of possibilities might be out there? Nikki, did you want to say a word before we get to Rory?
That was exactly what I wanted to say. Was a great segue. Just like the government's thinking about their 21-22 budgets, I know you all are as well. And this is I think a really excellent opportunity. We're doing the scenario planning workshop series, 5 2-hour sessions. We're going to start on September 14th, as you've heard me say, hopscotch our way through the holidays, and we end on November 2nd. We wanted to get it started. We don't want to draw it out too long. It's difficult timing, I know. But I hope that you will register a group from your organization. It could be board members, staff members, combination, whatever you think is right. And I'm happy to talk that through with you. For this opportunity, we're going to be working with a facilitator. She's super excited about doing this with us. She wants to offer office hours so we can consult with her between sessions if we want. And it's just a really great opportunity to do that scenario planning, think about different possible futures so that we can be best prepared in light of knowing that things are going to be different next year for many of our organizations. So hope you'll take us up on this opportunity. And please register. I think, did Mindy just put up the link? Yes, she did. Thank you. Like to have everybody registered by September 8th, right after Labor Day, so we can know where we stand to start on the 14th. And let me know if you have questions. Thanks.
Nikki, how much does this cost?
This is free for you.
Yeah.
And we're really excited to be partnering with JFNA, who's helping Federation defray the costs also so that we can provide this for our community.
I also, David mentioned an article about the deferred payroll taxes. I put that link in the chat as well. Okay, so there are probably some more thoughts and announcements. I know Scott has one as well, but I wanted to, we sent the information out and said that the focus of today's meeting was going to be a discussion from Rory about JCRE, and I'm just going to turn it over to her because I always mess up what the C in JCRE stands for, so I'll let you do it right.
Great, thanks, Brian, and hi, everyone. So JCRE is the Jewish Coalition for Racial Equity, which is, it's fair because we also get it confused ourselves, but the J is always Jewish, so that's always the easy place to start. So I want to just, I'll share a bit of what's going on and where we are and open it up for discussion and any questions that people have. I realize that there's been a lot that's been happening, and I, for one, am just feeling the loss of not being out and about and bumping into all of you at the random lunch meetings or dinner events or whatever it is that we're having where we're usually engaging in these conversations. And so I appreciate Brian giving us the opportunity to really share more broadly what's happening, because we haven't really had this chance to talk. JCRC, as many of you are probably aware through the council, many of you have agencies that are members of the council and send representatives. In 2018, November of 2018, we passed a policy that we called Addressing Racial Equity and Justice. And this is just a really important place to start, because JCRC does not work on any policy issues unless we have a documented policy that is voted on by, according to our bylaws, it has to be a majority, but typically we try to make it more consensus-based. So essentially, when we go to, if we're working with David in Jefferson City, or if we're putting out any kind of statements or any kind of work that we're doing, it's because it's first been vetted through the community representatives. And so in November of 2018, we put together this policy. It's available on our website. I can also put a link to it in the chat, I think. Maybe I can't do two things at once. So I'll send, I could always send that out if people want more information on that. And that really launched racial equity as a priority area for JCRC. We had been particularly focused in the area of criminal justice reform and had been planning to establish a Jewish Coalition for Racial Equity. And then that was somewhat waylaid by the pandemic, and then accelerated again after the death of George Floyd and the protests that started. So the vision originally for the JCRE was to have representatives of the various agencies who could come together and advise the JCRC. But what was originally supposed to be a 10 to 12 person committee through community interest then became a 40+ person committee that now has 3 subcommittees and has really hit the ground running. So just to give you a general overview of what it is that we're really trying to do through the JCRE, I'd say our general philosophy about this work, about racial equity work, is it really follows 2 main statements, maybe I'll call them. The first is that the work on racial justice has to follow the lead of the communities that are directly affected, including seeking leadership and guidance from Jews of color. So we recognize that this has to be ultimately the people who are impacted, and this is true for all of our work, that we have to take leadership by those who are impacted. It's very easy for us to talk about changes in policy when we don't really understand the depths of the ways that those changes in policy can impact the people who are most struggling with those policies. And so what we've done is we've really looked to our task force members to be liaisons for us to organizations and movements that are actively involved in such work across the region. So that's the first piece. And the second is the recognition that we will not be effective allies in the fight for racial justice without examining and processing our own histories and actions around racism and inclusion. So we recognize that as we talk about the work for racial equity, that we need to be really changing some of the attitudes and the conversation within our Jewish community, even as we're talking about the impact within the wider region. And so to that end, we are putting together a series of programs and opportunities for the community to engage that really work, I would say, on these 2 fronts simultaneously. These are not separate fronts, but this is really the guiding principles for us. And so through the task forces that we have, the subcommittees, I should say, we have a policy and advocacy subcommittee, which is evaluating policy issues that are related to racial equity to determine where our time and our voices can be most effective. So through the policy that we'd established and some of the educational programs, we talked about ways in which policing, healthcare, affordable housing, nutrition assistance, where there is documented proof of disproportionate impact on communities of color within St. Louis compared to not communities of color. And so looking at ways in which there are policy positions that are seeking to change some of those, and where JCRC can be mobilizing our Jewish community to then advocate on those policies or support those policies. One of those specifically has been heavily focused on voting rights and access to voting, especially in this election season. So we're really excited. In August, we partnered with NCJW to do a ballot notary drive. So especially in terms of communities of color who have become disproportionately impacted by COVID, both in terms of job security, in terms of health and access to healthcare and things like that, having more people who are able to still make sure that they can vote, but vote safely and vote remotely. But as many of you know, we the legislature passed the bill, so everyone is able to vote absentee, but unless you're voting specifically for health reasons, you need to have your ballot notarized, which could be difficult. And so we are working with NCJW again and a number of other partners to make sure that there's notaries available in neighborhoods throughout the community so that people know how they can get their ballots notarized. So that has to do with, and we can get into much more detail in terms of all of those sub areas. But so advocacy is one piece of it. Strengthening relationships with communities of color is another one of our subcommittees. This relates back to what I was also saying earlier. We recognize that much of this work is already happening and being led by communities of color within the region. And so a big part of what we want to do is just be plugged into those. We want to, for organizations that are looking to expand membership, we want to have members of our Jewish community where they're welcome to sit on those committees, to be active participants in it, to be liaisons for our Jewish community, to make sure that there are Jewish voices that are represented in those spaces, and to then really be the eyes and ears to hear what are the conversations that are happening where the Jewish community can, again, be most helpful. And then we have our programming subcommittee, and the programming subcommittee is the one that is putting together opportunities for our community to become more educated and explore other opportunities to get involved in this work. So the main thing, and with this then I'll stop and open it up for any questions or discussion. The main thing that the programming subcommittee is currently discussing is what we're calling a 100 level conference. So the sort of 101 in terms of racial equity work. And this is going to be a Zoom conference that will take place over the course of October and November with various opportunities for people to plug in. We're going to have a number of different speakers, with really each one kind of building off of the other, some partnership study, journaling, reflection. So really meant to engage people in a deeper level on this work, with the idea that from there also, again, having more opportunities for people to plug in the ways that they want to be plugged in. Just one other quick note on this. I will say, just going back to what we had originally said about needing to hear about this from the voices of those who are most impacted, we feel really fortunate to have Jews of color within St. Louis who are helping with this process, as well as nationally leadership within our Jewish community, and particularly people who are Jews of color who are working in this area of racial equity. So we have hired a consultant to work with us on a temporary basis named Tari Nusinoff, who is originally from St. Louis, but now is based in the California area. She's getting her PhD in racial justice work, and so she is consulting with us on this. We're also working, JFNA hired Rabbi Isaiah Rothstein as their scholar in residence, and he's doing work with the Jewish communities nationally on connecting with communities of color and the Jewish communities of color, and so we are consulting with him. And so we've really tried to I'm saying all of this, but a lot of this is really coming from deep dialogue with particularly the Black Jewish community, who is really helping to guide us in this process. So I know that was a lot of information. It was kind of a big information dump, and I'm happy to put some of this into email and follow up with everyone with more details on how to learn more. But I wanted to really give the big picture overview, and I'm happy to go into more detail in any particular area or answer any questions about it.
Thanks, Rory. Okay, obviously there's a lot going on in the community, in the world, in the United States around this. Yeah, what kinds of questions or thoughts do people have, either about how it relates to their own organization, institution, personally, or questions or concerns?
I have a question. This is Randy. Rory, is the conference for professionals, or is it for lay leaders, or for everyone?
So great question. The conference is open to everyone. And so it's not specifically targeting, it's welcome for professionals. It's not going to be a discourse that's targeting specifically just for the people who are working in the Jewish community, but it's really for anybody who wants to get a deeper understanding of what it is. What do we mean when we talk about racial equity? What is racial equity work? We're going to be opening with Yavila McCoy, who many of you know, also from St. Louis, nationally recognized for her work on racial equity and on talking about being both Jewish and Black. And so it's really meant to be an entry point for anybody who wants to, while at the same time it's not going to be it's not going to be so basic that if people have engaged that they should feel like it's boring, but it's really meant to be educational while also being an opportunity for people to really feel like, I don't know the first thing, and so I can't show up to this meeting because I don't know where to begin, right? This is really meant to sort of just be like, here's an easy way to really plug in, while also for those of us who have been doing the work, still really learning a lot more and expanding our knowledge.
Other thoughts or questions?
Do you prefer, Rory, that people plug in at this point through that conference rather than joining one of the committees? I've had some board members, as we do work here in our organization, if they can still get involved in the committees and things like that.
Great. Yes, both, all of the above. So I would say for those people who want to be getting involved in committees, that's a great way. So let me actually just say a word. The committees, so we have now, JCRE is kind of the umbrella of these 3 subcommittees. The JCRE, the plan is for that group to meet quarterly. So for people who are passionate about this, who want to serve in an advisory role, but who can't commit to a large scale commitment, that's a great place for them to plug in, because that's the lower level time commitment. The committees are meeting on a much more frequent basis as they're getting the project out, but we still are plugging people in. Our goal for JCRE is to have representatives from all of the different agencies. So many of you have heard separately from my colleagues, from Alyssa and Cheryl, who have asked for you to send representatives. And this is both because we want to have a diverse range of voices within our community to inform us, but also because similar to the council, we see it as bi-directional. We want to know what your agencies are doing. We want them to be able to tell your agencies what's happening, and we want to be able to really expand all of the work. So if you don't have a representative on JCRE, we'd love to make sure that you have one. If you have people who are passionate, who want to get involved in a committee, we still will take people into the committees, and there likely will be new committees that will form as new programs are brainstormed. But if there are people who are sort of interested but not sure, then this conference, or even if they're on a committee, right, this conference is just a great place for them also to plug in. And the hope is that for those people who are really just kind of looking to understand better, that we will have takeaways from the conference that will be more opportunities for them to plug in. So depending on kind of where they are, we'll take them at every place that they are.
Thanks, Rory.
Other stuff. Look, I think we all said from the beginning that these are issues and challenges that have existed for a long time. They aren't going to be something that we're able to just snap our fingers and either understand or address right away. And so the idea of a conference that has some heft and weight and time to it that extends is important, because you're talking about changing people's thoughts and behaviors and attitudes potentially, and those things don't happen quickly. And I'm really appreciative of the fact, personally, of the fact that we have engaged the Jews of color in these discussions and putting these things together, because it's part of the reason why we're having the conversation to begin with, is because maybe we haven't done that as well as we could have in the past.
Yeah, I'll also just add, if there's a little, as you think of any other questions, I also want to just put in a plug. There is a group that we got connected with called Eidot Midwest. It's a play off of Eidot Mizrach, for that, those of you who know that phrase. And they are a coalition of people who are trying to really plug in Jews of color in various organizations in the Midwest. So they heard about the work happening in St. Louis. They got really excited. They're going to be serving as a co-sponsor for the conference and also helping to guide us. And have actually asked if we could open that up to some other Midwest cities, just people who could plug in over Zoom to show that as a model. So we're excited to see that communities of color are seeing this as opportunities for them to really show others what could be done. And I want to also just say that there's been a lot of conversations that have been happening about particularly Black Lives Matter and ways in which Black Lives Matter has people within it who are anti-Semitic or has anti-Zionist platforms. And we don't have to unpack all of that. I'm happy to talk to people separately about it. I think that it is appropriate to say that within every movement, there are going to be multitudes of people, and there are certainly people within the movement who are themselves anti-Semitic. And I think that when that happens, we have a responsibility to call that out and to fight against it. But just last week, there was a great article actually in JTA, because the Movement for Black Lives, which had issued the platform in 2015, that included within it calling Israel a genocide state and saying that the United States was complicit in Israel is an apartheid state, and saying the United States was complicit in a genocide, which sort of sparked a lot of these conversations, just met last week to talk about their newest platform. And all reports right now are showing that there's been no specific mention of Israel and Palestine within their newest platform. We don't have the final platform. It's still somewhat in the works, but many people are saying that a lot of this really is just the work of the relationship building. And that's where I think JCRC really sees ourselves, that as there are situations where these can get really uncomfortable, we want to have seats at the table. This is part of why we want to make sure that members of our Jewish community who are passionate about this work are going to the NAACP meetings, and they're going to the Expect Us meetings, and they can then be the people who speak up to say, hey, actually that's not what we want to be focused on, or that's not appropriate, or that's going to be offensive, or can we have a private conversation about why that plays into an anti-Semitic trope? We feel, and certainly there might be times where we do that, and if that's not welcome feedback, and if we're pushed out, then we're going to have other conversations in terms of what the follow-up next steps. But we don't feel like it's our role to absent ourselves from those spaces. If anything, absenting ourselves is where you create a vacuum, and then chaos is able to enter. And so I'm happy to talk. I know there's a lot of discussion about it. There might be people that you hear from who say, I want to get involved in this work, but I'm worried about anti-Semitism. That's where working through the committee means that we're all involved with it. We're able to support people through it. We're able to constantly monitor and discuss it. But overwhelmingly, what we've heard back from people is that while those are the stories that sometimes get highlighted in the Jewish press, that's not the overwhelming experience. And we want to be present so that if such an experience does happen, we're able to respond to it immediately and cut it off at its knees before any situation continues to escalate.
Any other questions or thoughts? Certainly be in touch with Rory or Joe directly. If you do, after this, have some thoughts as well. Okay. If there's nothing else right now, I know Scott at least was on. Scott, are you still on?
Yes, sir.
Did you want to talk about the high holidays, or just in general, what's going on?
Sure. Just in general, what we're going to try to do this year, because things are a little bit different, and there are a variety of service opportunities. For instance, we'll be looking at everything from outdoor services, outdoor gatherings, to indoor in-person gatherings, to virtual gatherings. So we're really across the board in terms of what we're going to be dealing with this year. We are going to be providing some unique services that we haven't provided in the past, in terms of some level of security coverage for cluster areas and some sort of rapid response type scenario that we're working on right now. But the most important thing is for each organization that's intending on doing anything for the high holidays to get me that schedule and some details on that, and then to schedule a site walkthrough with me so that we can discuss if they are having outdoor events, that type of thing, what applications and what security enhancements might be available to make those events safer.
Thanks. Anybody have any questions for Scott around security, whether it's the high holidays or not, or otherwise? All right, in terms of formal updates and things, that's what we've got. It's time for you guys now. Who has something they either want to talk about or share or bring up or whatever it might be? Anyone? How's everybody feeling in general?
Anybody cooking for Rosh Hashanah yet? There we go.
Can I say one quick thing about the Jewish holidays? we often see around the Jewish holidays an increase in need for food and food insecurity. So I just wanted to remind everyone, we have this food resource on our website, all of the places where people can access food for subsidized or no cost. So just want to remind everyone that those resources are out there. We will send another email with all that information, but just want to remind everyone that that will be a continued need, as I'm sure you're all aware, around the holidays, and just to be aware of what the resources are in our community.
While we're on resources, those kinds of things, is anybody having any issues or concerns about PPE as they're thinking about reopening, about obtaining, finding those kinds of resources? I know that we've put out the JFNA portal, which I know Hillel, for example, has been ordering stuff through, and others, but I just want to make sure. Any issues, concerns, challenges with PPE? I mean, aside from just paying for it, which may be a whole different kind of conversation, but obtaining, well, that's good then. Okay. Other thoughts, questions, things people want to bring up or talk about or share? You know, we're like a family. You can share here. All right, Greg.
Well, then I'll serve my really crucial role when I say thanks for being here. If you have questions, concerns, comments, reach out, and look forward to seeing you all next Thursday.